Welcome to GW Integrative Medicine, the podcast about disease prevention and health promotion from the Office of Integrative Medicine and Health at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences.
I'm Dr. Lee Frame, Director of the Integrative Medicine Programs and an Associate Professor in the Department of Clinical Research and Leadership here at GW.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez, the office's Administrative Director. Today on the pod, we talk about nutrition studies and how to better understand them with nutrition scientists Danny Lennon and Alan Flanagan of Sigma Nutrition.
Sigma Nutrition provides objective, high-quality, evidence-based information on nutrition. It produces educational content aimed at dietitians, nutritionists, health and fitness professionals, nutrition science academics, and those interested in the details of and gaining a better understanding of nutrition science.
Danny is the founder of and head of content for Sigma Nutrition, and Alan is the company's research communications officer. You'll find both of them on the highly popular Sigma Nutrition radio podcast.
Welcome to GW Integrative Medicine, Danny and Alan.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Huge fan of the pod, huge fan of the work that you're doing. And I think this all kind of spurred, actually, we had Danny on a previous episode, and we were just talking about how a lot of people don't even know what they don't know about nutrition science. So maybe we could start there.
I'll let you kick that one off, Alan.
Yeah, I'm going to maybe provide somewhat of a teleological answer to this. In the interest of time and convenience for listeners, we had a very late evolution of nutrition as a formal science. There were kind of steps in the 19th century whereby it was becoming clear that certain compounds or certain properties of food were related to health and disease states, particularly related to single nutrient deficiencies. Although it wasn't until 1913 that the first micronutrients, vitamins, were synthesized. And that really started a domino effect of nutrition in what is sometimes termed its golden era, because single nutrient deficiency states are readily identifiable. There's a very high prevalence in a population exposed to deficiency states. And they're also remedied quite rapidly once that particular nutrient has been provided across the population. At the same time, we have the emergence of, in the post-war period, the kind of evidence-based medical model, very much centering around the concept of randomized controlled trials, double blinding, and certain methodological criteria. And it seemed that the potential success of single nutrient-focused nutrition in that particular era somewhat merged with the emergence of the evidence-based medical model to create a paradigm that emphasized testing nutrients as if they were drugs. The idea that we could package synthetic vitamin E and give it as a treatment as if we were giving a drug, and compare it to a placebo as if they were genuinely not exposed to that nutrient, became the dominant lens through which nutrition research was conducted. It was an awkward fit, and it created a kind of perception that nutritional epidemiology was reliable because multiple of these large trials found null findings. And we ended up somewhere in the 2000s with this truism that nutrition was a field of shoddy methodological rigor, heavily reliant on prospective cohort studies that apparently were very unreliable. And much of this was criticism from a place of complete lack of domain-specific expertise. Most of the kind of strenuous critiques were from people that were not even in the field. And it kind of became this status quo of the impression of nutrition research. And it meant, unfortunately, that I think only in the last 5 to 10 years have people within nutrition really started pushing back and publishing papers and emphasizing there are unique characteristics to studying diet and nutrients and foods and food groups as an exposure of interest that warrant specific methodological considerations. And we're still kind of picking up the pieces with this assumption that that nutrition is an unreliable field. But my argument has always been that perceived unreliability stems from kind of forcing the study of nutrition through this kind of particular methodological criteria of doing research that the evidence-based medical model provided.
Danny, do you want to add to that?
I think Alan has captured the issue particularly well, and I think off the back of that, much of our conversations over time have been trying to give people guidance on this of, okay, given this background, the context Alan just has put forward, how do we then go forward and answer questions about nutrition? How do we do that in an appropriate way? How do we evaluate evidence? And how do we get away from overly reductionist ways of thinking about what is good or bad evidence or what is a good or bad study? And one example of that, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later on, has been through the classic hierarchy of evidence that everyone has probably seen, where you have your randomized control trials or meta-analyses sitting atop of this. And sometimes the presumption that people can come to is that, well, these are good studies to rely on, and then the rest is worse than that. And therefore, if we're looking to judge a particular question or answer a question, we will just look there, and that's going to supersede everything else. And of course, there's multiple flaws with that type of thinking, particularly when it comes to nutrition. And I'm sure we're going to explore those. And I think that probably the big thing that we're going to discuss much of today, which I think is the most important, is seeing that nutrition science is a distinct field in and of itself, that, as Alan has pointed to, there is a requirement for domain-specific expertise and understanding of the field, because the exposure we're looking at is quite distinct from other fields. And as Alan pointed out with the example, if we look at if we're trying to do something and compare it to like a drug trial with an exposure like nutrition, we're going to run into problems very quickly. And so we have to see that there are some unique challenges for doing nutrition science. And particularly when we're trying to answer the questions we care about, most notably, they tend to be diet disease relationship questions. Then we need to have an understanding of those challenges, understand what type of research questions we need to ask, and then understand what type of methodology would be appropriate for different types of research questions, as opposed to just presuming one trial design is going to be better than others, or other types of simplistic ways of thinking that we can maybe run into.
Yeah, that's what I see a lot when I work with clinicians and try to teach them about nutrition. They're simply trying to apply the biomedical pharmaceutical model that they've learned, right? That's all that they know about research, is this research hierarchy, and kind of the way it's taught is that it's gospel. But it's very clear from the nutrition field that you have to have more nuance and more critical thought when you're investigating studies, particularly when you're thinking about the study design.
Yeah, I think design is probably where the majority of some of these pitfalls, I think, in interpretation of nutrition research can come along. And even in the design, within the field, we still have people kind of, doing the same thing and expecting to get a different finding in terms of, trying to do drug style, RCTs. And it's not that randomized trials themselves or the process of randomization is an issue, but if we work through some of the methodological components of what's considered a very high internal validity trial in the biomedical model, we can immediately see some challenges for nutrition. So the first, as I know you'll be familiar with, Lee, is the concept of a placebo. So all individuals in the population are constantly exposed to nutrients. We don't have deficiency states in the population for the most part anymore. And where we do, they're exceptionally rare. This is very different to the idea that someone in the population just has some statin floating around in their system. They don't, unless they've taken that drug. So in a biomedical trial, you can compare an active treatment to a true zero exposure, because the individuals or the entire control group do not habitually have bits of that drug in their circulation. Nutrition trials are the complete opposite of that. Even if you are giving someone vitamin C as your treatment, everyone in the control group has sufficient vitamin C or they would have scurvy. So you're not actually comparing what these trials make assumptions that they are comparing, and a treatment to no treatment. You're never actually comparing a treatment to a placebo, because everyone in the placebo group has at least sufficient status of that given nutrient. And that actually creates a different research question. And if we think then about blinding as a concept, well, double blinding's easy to do if you are giving a drug and it's, appearance and taste matched placebo that has been, created to act as the placebo to that drug. If you are asking people to consume a specific amount of a given food, or several foods, if it's a dietary pattern intervention, you're asking them to make multiple changes, they're not going to do that with a blindfold on. It is a requirement of the intervention that they are unblinded, because it's essentially a behavioral trial. You are asking them to comply with it. And then we have various assumptions for, treatment effects that go into the high internal validity double-blind RCT. An important one is independence of outcome effects, essentially. If you're giving someone a drug, comparing it to a group not getting that drug, and you've randomized them and created well-matched groups that are exchangeable but for the addition of the intervention or the treatment to the intervention group, then ultimately we can be more confident concluding that any change in your outcome is a downstream effect of that drug, of that treatment. That's almost impossible to do with the nature of diet, because if you're asking someone to suddenly add, X amount, 4 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil a day, by increasing the proportion of unsaturated fat in their diet, you're changing corresponding proportions of other macronutrients in the diet. So true kind of outcome effects, true independence of outcome effects, is often not necessarily something that's readily achievable. And rather than kind of think our way around this as a field, we've kind of just lumped on banging our heads against the wall, assuming that, one day the great mega trial will come along with, thousands of participants and a very clearly defined intervention and outcome effects, and suddenly nutrition will be reliable, rather than here are these issues we cannot get around because of the nature of what we're actually studying, which is diets, foods, and food groups and nutrients. So let's think about how that applies to our methodology and work around the methodological aspects and tailor them more to the exposure that we're interested in.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And so what has happened is we've turned to using methods that just don't quite fit. One of the ones that always comes to mind in this space is, we had observational data showing that diets high in vitamin E are incredibly beneficial. So we decided to design a study in which we deliver vitamin E in a capsule, and we assumed that would be the same thing. Mm-hmm. But it's not, right? People are getting vitamin E from a food, and what is coming with that food is much more complex, and is it displacing something else in their diet?
Yes, and this introduces this I think we can create a nice concrete example here, moving from the abstract for listeners, because when we mentioned earlier that there's no zero exposure in human nutrition, that anyone in your control group has enough vitamin E, for example, in this context, we had all of this observational epidemiology comparing high versus low levels of dietary vitamin E. And vitamin E consumed through the diet is, 8 isoforms, 4, tocopherols, 4 tocotrienols. And that's not what is packaged in a synthetic form for a supplement. It's typically just alpha tocopherol that's used in that context. And in epidemiology, we're typically able to compare a wider range of individual intakes with a bigger sample of the population. So we do have individuals within that cohort who are genuinely at a much lower intake. And we have individuals that are at a higher intake. So for example, some of the beneficial effects were observed comparing individuals consuming over 18 milligrams a day, at least over 15 milligrams a day, compared to people consuming less than 6. Well, if you then look at the RCTs that try to test the effect of vitamin E on some of these outcomes, everyone in the included cohort of the trial, whether they were in the placebo group or the intervention group, all had more than adequate intakes of vitamin E. There was no range of levels of intake. They were all relatively well stocked for the nutrient that they were testing. So you're not actually testing the true effect that was being suggested by epidemiology, was taking people from low levels of intake compared to high levels of intake. The trial should have tested that question, and the numerous trials that found null findings of vitamin E basically tested, is more of enough better than more than enough, which is a very different question to testing kind of, the low versus high types of intakes that we would have observed in the prospective cohort studies.
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly common. And I was just giving a lecture in Malibu this weekend, and one of the speakers before me presented a study in which the the group was given more fiber in their diet. And they were talking about how it didn't have the outcomes we would expect it to have. But if you drill down, the amount of fiber they started with was 22 grams, when the average American has 14 grams of fiber. So they're already almost twice as high as the average American. So yeah, we didn't expect to see improvements. But then it gets worse. They gave them 45 grams of fiber, which probably is too much. So, it's about getting the right dose. And we don't think about dose when we're doing these trials. We don't think about the dose that it's actually being exposed to. We're trying to give a standardized dose because we're using the biomedical pharmaceutical model.
Yes, and typically that's within a population, in if they're included in a randomized trial, typically they're at least more than sufficient in that nutrient, because most ethics committees are not going to approve recruiting individuals that are deficient or even just insufficient in that intake. So it's a real issue. And again, like you said, the lack of consideration of dose, I would say, is one of the most fundamental methodological limitations in nutrition, because it all comes down to dose. In terms of what we gather as an understanding of the effects of any given kind of nutrient or food. Typically, no nutrient is necessarily beneficial, or even nutrients of concern like sodium. We need some sodium in the diet, or saturated fat. There's no diet in the world that's 0% saturated fat. So it's not in and of itself, in isolation, harmful, so to speak. It's related to the dose in the diet. And I think, unfortunately, when it comes to a lot of trials in this kind of design, like you described, they're really arbitrary selections of dosing without much thought as to where our beneficial thresholds generally may be observed, or where our adverse effects observed, and creating meaningful comparisons in intervention trials. And most intervention trials have very paltry or to no variability really between the comparison groups. And for nutrition, if you've no variability in your supposed exposure between your two groups, you're just not going to detect anything. It's going to be noise, because nutrients and diets and the nature of it act within biological range. And again, whereas drugs are designed to, take someone with really high blood pressure and get that blood pressure down, like that's typically, we're dealing with more sensitive effect sizes. It's not that they're not there, but if we're not thinking about the dose comparison, often whatever effect size is there is washed out in noise.
So what are some of the topics that you think could be most beneficial to someone who, is a clinician, has a healthcare background, but just doesn't have the nutrition science expertise to get in the literature and understand what's going on?
One thing I would say that relates to what has been spoken about so far is that connects both of those things, is thinking about that exposure that we're talking about in nutrition, and a few of those things that Alan has already outlined, of noting that we are talking about an exposure here where we can't have zero exposure. As Alan noted, we can't have someone with zero vitamin D, as an example. And with diet, we have this long-term continuous exposure that we're consuming across multiple meals daily over a long period of time. And so we can't have this zero exposure, which we might get nicely in a drug trial, for example. And so that lends itself then to thinking about what types of questions and designs we might have. And particularly when we look at some of the chronic disease literature that we care about, the reason why a lot of times we're looking at epidemiology and prospective cohort studies is because it's particularly well suited to answer some of these questions we care about. Now, with that, when we consider this exposure we've discussed, means that we are comparing a high versus low exposure. We're not comparing this zero that we have. So it's a high versus low. But when we're trying to piece through some of the literature, this raises the questions that I think are most useful for understanding if a particular study is actually giving us the answers we want, or was carried out effectively or not. And that would relate to, well, when we're comparing high versus low, and either we might find that there was a meaningful effect of, or a meaningful difference, or that there was null findings. Regardless of the result, we have to consider what was high and low in this particular study, and was this high and low suitable? So if we have quartiles of intake for a particular our exposure that we're caring about, and we're comparing this high versus low, Alan has pointed to a couple of things already. First, we have to think about, was there a sufficient contrast between that high and low? Because if there's not a sufficient contrast, we can't expect to find a result. And maybe if we're getting null findings, it's simply a function of not having a sufficient contrast between those exposures. The second thing would be, was the actual amount of that intake? So and where does that sit in relation to what we already know about that particular exposure? So this speaks to your example, Lee, with the dietary fiber, that we can look at what was the actual fiber intake in an absolute amount in this particular study. And then we can consider that in the context of what we know about this nutrient more broadly. Where do we tend to see increased risk? Where do we tend to see beneficial effects? And therefore, are the levels that are being used in the study actually appropriate? So we have all these questions that relate to our exposure or the particular dose here, and understanding that because of the way we're doing many of these trials, and in this context, I'm talking, of course, about when we're looking at epidemiology, we have this high versus low comparison, but we need to make sure that's appropriate. And there's a bunch of examples where we can point to where some of the findings of studies have been misleading because of an inappropriate contrast between the high and low in a particular study, or that when we think about what that means in the broader context of a nutrient, it's that the high and low exposure amount in that study wasn't actually appropriate. And there's a bunch of examples we can get into if we need to, but there are first few things that I would put on the radar that are quite distinct about some of the trials, or certainly the epidemiology that we'd have in nutrition, and how that would be related to this unique exposure we have in nutrition, which is different to other types of exposures.
Yeah, there's actually an example, Danny, we've used a few times, and Lee, you might be familiar with it. There was a study came out in 2020, made a lot of headlines, as these kind of studies tend to do, and it suggested that a higher saturated fat intake lowered risk of stroke by about 14 or 15%. And then you go to, it was a meta-analysis, the messiest of all research designs for nutrition.
But I thought it was at the top of the hierarchy, Alan.
Yeah, there you go. It's sitting there, so it must be true. And of course, that's how it was shared. You know, this is a meta-analysis. This is robust evidence. And you dig into the primary included studies. These were prospective cohort studies by a group in the group itself, the research group, were in China, but whatever their inclusion criteria applied, they ended up with a preponderance of data from East Asian cohorts. And you started to look at the absolute comparisons, the absolute amounts of saturated fat in some of the Japanese cohorts, for example, and there were several included in this meta-analysis. The highest intake was around 21 grams a day. That's around, based on the general kind of 2,500 calorie recommended diet, around 10%, the threshold we want people to get to, compared to intakes that were often less than 7 grams a day, 2-3% of energy intake. So essentially the entire comparison of, quote, high versus low, which is misleading language in this context, because the entirety of the range of the comparison was within recommended levels of less than 10% saturated fat. So the appropriate interpretation of the study would have been saturated fat consumption within recommended ranges, lower risks of stroke, not high saturated fat intake lowers risk of stroke. And this issue we see play out in randomized controlled trials of this same question, and indeed in the meta-analyses of that. And there's only a few meta-analyses of control trials that have specifically considered baseline starting saturated fat content. And if you're comparing trials where baseline levels were less than 15-14% of energy, you're not getting anything but noise in your outcome compared to your control group. If you've got groups that were over 18% or at least over 16% and over, then you start to see a more consistent signal in the noise, that lowering from those thresholds and getting it down to, 10, 11% is where we see the significant reduction in cardiovascular disease events. And so suddenly the epidemiology starts to match up when we actually think about the doses more. But this kind of relatively kind of absent consideration of these doses is where so much of the supposed controversy comes from. And yet it's fundamental both to the interpretation of cohort studies and to the design and execution and interpretation of intervention trials.
And I think just to add one more thing, and another example that Alan and I have talked about before that might be particularly useful for people, relates to why we can actually reconcile a lot of the findings that sometimes seem conflicting in nutrition, because that's often the criticism you hear from outside the field, right? Of nutrition is just so messy because everything is conflicting. And there's one example that we've pointed to is when you look at some of the big cohort studies that have been published on, say, red meat intake, you can see some conflicting findings. And the example we've used is if you look at the NIH AARP study, where they had this quite a large effect. So you have this 21% or a hazard ratio of 1.21. You have this really strong impact when you're comparing high versus low for red meat intake. And then you go to another cohort like the Japan Collaborative Cohort Study, and there you see a hazard ratio of 1.0, so you're seeing no effect. You have this wide confidence interval crossing the null. And so this suggesting that, well, we're not detecting effect here. And instead of throwing our hands up and saying, well, look, here's more conflicting findings, nothing really makes sense because we have the same normal exposure, red meat intake, we have the same outcome. Why are we seeing these conflicting findings? If we start drilling in and thinking about this concept of exposure and what was high and low in those particular cohorts, we can see in one particular sense, we're comparing a low intake of 21 grams a day to a high of 172 grams a day, and we're seeing a significant increase in risk. And then when we're in the Japanese cohort, we're seeing a comparison of 10 grams per day to 77 grams per day in the high group. And so this may start to indicate to us, well, maybe that high intake isn't sufficiently high where we're going to start seeing an increase in risk. And so therefore we can start reconciling, at least in part, maybe some of these findings. And of course, there's other things going on because we have different cohorts with different background characteristics, all these other important questions that we can maybe get to. But at least when we start looking at this exposure, we can see that there are differences in what we're actually comparing. And just because one study or all our studies are looking at this contrast, the actual amounts may be different. And that might start to give us some clues as to why some of these findings are in conflict. And it's the bigger point is to say not necessarily that any of these are wrong. There's not one that has to be right and one that is wrong. It's simply that for the particular population we're looking at with this particular type of exposure and all the other factors that goes into it, this was the result we found for this study. And that can be different depending on these factors when we're looking at different cohorts. And so that's one example where we can maybe start reconciling some of the conflicting findings in the field, and we start to see actually everything is not a mess, and we can actually get to some conclusions in this field.
Yeah, and I think that's another issue with nutrition is we have a lot of influencers and people with beliefs about nutrition, and if they want to, they can go in the literature and probably find something that will support them. But they're not diving in deep enough to say, okay, maybe this doesn't really support what I'm saying, but the average person who's then reading that doesn't know the difference.
Yeah, I've kind of thought about why this may be over the years, and I for me, the lowest hanging fruit explanation has always been because of the kind of ubiquity of diet and nutrition. The kind of trope that everyone eats, so everyone's an expert. But I think that there is a real kernel of truth in that. You know, if you take another very kind of niche domain. I mean, I have a friend who has a background in physics. I don't know the first thing about physics. There's no way in the world that I could ever pretend to have any sort of opinion because it's so domain specific. It's so, kind of niche as a field, and as the required kind of content specific and domain specific knowledge, that no one's ever going to kind of jump up and say, yeah, no, I know what's going on here. With diet, we have the exact opposite, really. I think we have this kind of culture where everyone rows in on it. It's not even confined to social media influencers. I would say that, I mean, if you look at where a lot of the noise on social media comes from, unfortunately, it is people with MD after their name. Even if they're not necessarily practicing, they're still leveraging the authority bias that comes with a few qualifications. Over here in the UK, we've got people that are actively working in science that are also some of the biggest sources of really kind of shoddy, bad information projected onto social media. So I think the problem with nutrition then is everyone is talking about it. Influencers, doctors, other scientists from other fields. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry has their view, and that's almost impossible as a landscape to try and navigate through, especially with a subject that, because of the nature of diets being intensely personal, and they can be influenced by a myriad of factors, whether it's an individual's beliefs, values, ethics, religion plays a role, culture, region, all of these kind of variables that go into creating something that its value laden kind of component is inherently subjective. And we see that play out kind of on the extremes of the various diet tribes, so to speak. But I think that I think it's a feature, not a bug. And I've never actually figured out a way that resolves itself, or that there's a way in our current information ecosystems to try and improve on that. And, that's really why Danny and myself do what we do, is to try and carve out at least some oasis in the middle of this information ecosystem where people that are drowning at sea might wash up and hopefully, find it beneficial.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because I know, well, obviously you have the podcast, which is an excellent source of information, but you're putting together a course for people who, now that they've heard this podcast, they realize, oh man, I really don't know how to analyze a nutrition science research study. So you have this course that they can take to learn the basics, the fundamentals that they need to know. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So in short, it's a course called Applied Nutrition Literacy. We've had one previous cohort go through it. We're soon to have the second cohort start on that. And it's aimed at people who do have probably some really good understanding, oftentimes, that people who are taking this course of nutrition or of health science, or are practicing in the field of either nutrition or medicine, but want to be able to read and interpret research themselves with a degree of confidence, and to be able to do that firsthand, and then get beyond this kind of confusion that we oftentimes see of everywhere on the internet, where, oh, a study shows this, or research tells us X, and it's this generic thing without being able to have confidence of, is something valid or not? Or we see someone on social media waving around a study, making a claim. How do we evaluate if this not only fits with the broader literature, but also, is this a quote unquote good or bad study, or how much can we rely on this to make a certain claim? And then, of course, many of the things we've discussed so far about the unique aspects of nutrition science. And so we basically, because we had known many people who do have very specific knowledge, and even within nutrition, but maybe the point where most people were looking for is that real, true confidence in their ability to go and read primary research for themselves, and to be able to make that decisions from that and be able to evaluate research for themselves, where to go for that type of information. And so that's essentially what the course is aimed at across 8 different modules that we have, which we can get through. But that covers not only an active process of going through and reading and interpreting a study, but going through these different types of study designs that we've mentioned. So looking at nutritional epidemiology, looking at RCTs within nutrition, meta-analyses within nutrition, examples of those and how we might go and analyze and interpret those. And then some of the broader, I suppose, big meta skills that are most important of how do we bring all this back in and make conclusions on an overall body of evidence. Essentially, that is the aim of the course for people that do have quite advanced level of knowledge, but maybe wanting to get to that final part of being really confident in their ability to read research, interpret that appropriately, put that in context, and also be able to go and find answers to research questions for themselves without having to necessarily rely on secondhand accounts from other people and just take someone's word for it almost. And so that's the general idea. And so far we've been absolutely delighted with the first cohort of people that have gone through. We've had a range of people, like I mentioned, that come from different backgrounds. That's either in dietetics or family physicians or GPs, or people that are within academia or nutrition science students. And we've been delighted with that feedback so far. And so that's the general overview, but I'm sure there's some things to add that I've maybe forgotten. So Alan, if you want to add anything, you can jump in.
I think you nailed it. I think, that was really our focus. It ended up being a journey. We first brainstormed the idea in 2019, and then between various other projects and, being busy, we eventually kind of took a while to get around to it. But we very much wanted to put the methodological foot forward and in relation to a lot of these issues we've been discussing, because that is kind of the crux of it. There's very little point in trying to think about, oh, well, this trial came out and it, had null findings, or this cohort study came out and suggested a counterintuitive finding of, like we mentioned earlier, for example, the high saturated fat associated with lower risk of stroke, in the absence of actually having the kind of toolbox kitted out to understand, oh, these are the things I want to look for here. I want to know what the absolute levels of intake that fed into this comparison are. I want to know what the baseline nutritional status in the trial in an intervention was, or was it even measured? So many trials don't even bother. And with that emphasis on these kind of methodological components of nutrition, obviously being brought to life with case studies and examples from the published literature. But we thought that was probably the best service that we could do for people that are already reading research. But I think anyone that's gone through their undergrad in nutrition and dietetics, or certainly med school, where there's very little kind of nutrition included in the curriculum, and other kind of allied healthcare professional disciplines where they've come out of an undergrad, they've gone on maybe to do an MSc, and at really little point along the way is there very much time given to these kind of things. I mean, certainly, my master's, I thought I got a huge amount of benefit from, but thinking back to the methodological components, it was very much, you're handed the CASP guidelines or some similar tool, which is essentially a box ticking exercise for critical appraisal. And I think that was very much at the core of motivating us to even those guidelines are generic. If you can take one of those guidelines and seemingly apply it to a nutrition trial as much as a trial in psychology, it's probably not capturing the domain-specific requirements of thinking about the methodological challenges and thinking a bit deeper about how we might interpret the research that we're given. So, I think fundamentally for its first iteration, we were quite happy that people that do this should come out the other end feeling fairly bolstered in their skill set of being able to actually apply these domain specific critiques to any kind of given nutrition study that they're looking at, whether a cohort or an RCT or a meta-analysis.
Well, that sounds fantastic. And to me, I think particularly beneficial for clinicians who, research is not the primary thing that they're learning, right? They read the literature, they may even talk about the literature in their coursework, but it's really not what they're learning. And so having something that is specifically going to teach them how to address the research, and particularly in this space where it's actually a little bit different than just the hierarchy pyramid, I feel like this could be very beneficial. So with that, is there any last little tidbits you want to leave for us to think about nutrition science methodology?
For me, the one that I always want to kind of emphasize, particularly if it's to clinicians within medicine, is that this idea that there is terrible inconsistency in nutrition and that RCTs kind of rubbish epidemiology and that epidemiology isn't reliable. These are really relative straw men with regard to the field. And there's been some really refined work done in the last few years that's actually stacked up that question. How consistent are prospective cohort studies compared to randomized trials where you actually take the time to match a cohort study and the RCT along the kind of population included, the type of exposure? Was it diet compared to diet, or was it diet compared to supplement, and the outcomes? When you actually really match, particularly the exposure, you see congruence, not just in the direction of effect, like a cohort study found lower risk, the trial finds lower risk as well, but also in the effect estimates. And I think this is really important. It's, for me, very much an example of how the supposed inconsistencies are where the actual exposure of interest isn't well matched. And so if a cohort study is investigating dietary exposure and a trial compares a supplement version of the nutrient in question, that's where the inconsistency and incongruence arises. But they're testing very different research questions. So actually at its core, when we apply more rigorous definitions to considering the two study designs and their relative concordance, we actually see concordance and consistency in direction of effect, in magnitude of effect. And I think overall this goes a long way to kind of falsifying this relatively, I think, intellectually lazy premise that nutrition is an unreliable field and that RCTs are constantly contradicting epidemiological findings.
Yeah, I think I would add to that is really at the core of this, particularly when we're making this comparison between these distinct fields. And as Alan outlined, we have these really nice analyses now showing that consistency between RCTs and epidemiology for many of these different exposures and outcomes that we're testing. And then beyond that, where cases where we do see disagreement, which does indeed happen, not defaulting to this idea that, well, RCTs are the gold standard. So if there's a difference between what we're seeing in the RCTs and the epidemiology, this is proof that the epidemiology is wrong because it's terrible science or whatever claim people are making. Whereas that is not necessarily the case. We have to drill into what that is going on. And I think one example that comes to mind that I think we've also talked about in the course is some examples of fiber and colorectal cancer, where there had been claims made by certain people of, well, some of this impact of higher dietary fiber isn't maybe so important because here's some RCTs where more fiber doesn't help with this outcome. When you start drilling into that, indeed, there are some RCTs without any beneficial impact, but there's the specific nature of them we have to consider. So the outcome that was being looked at was a recurrence of colorectal adenomas in people with a history of that disorder, and they failed to see a protective effect by supplementing isolated sources of fiber. And so if you're trying to say that this is showing that there's no impact of fiber on colorectal cancer risk, that's a very different question than what you think you're answering, because in the cohort studies we have this really clear evidence that dietary patterns higher in fiber are protective against colorectal cancer or reducing that risk when we can have a fair comparison of high versus low in these studies. And so because we see a conflict here, we're not going to default and say, well, an RCT didn't show an effect here, so that's all I need to think about. We need to be a bit more critical and say, well, hold on, this was a RCT, so it's going to be shorter with that follow-up. We're looking at different endpoints and different outcomes, really. And then also we're looking at a trial that's assessing isolated fiber supplementation as opposed to higher or lower fiber dietary patterns. And so these are some of the things to keep in mind. And I think, Alan done a great job of summarizing that real core issue that is probably most pertinent to people, particularly coming from a biomedical background.
Well, I think that sums it up. So thank you so much for joining us, Alan and Danny. It was really a pleasure having you.
Thanks so much for having us.
This is the GW Integrative Medicine Podcast from the GW Office of Integrative Medicine and Health.
I'm Dr. Lee Frame.
And I'm Janet Rodriguez.
Thanks for listening.
Okay.
All right.